Now there's a word that people use, maybe a phrase that people use.
The pricing committee,
kind of
velvet rope cartel,
them
turning
trying
every
to show
checkout
their
into Dante's
intelligence.
seventh hell.
And that phrase is a paradigm shift. And you'll hear it all the time. This is a paradigm shift. There's going to be a paradigm shift. That represents a paradigm shift. And what they're essentially saying is, one, I'm intelligent. And two, we don't really know how to predict what the next phase is, but we know we're going to go through the next phase. And so if you apply that to where we are, a couple of things happened this week in the UK. The first thing that happened is that we had the Prime Minister resign. And the second thing that happened is we had another ceasefire, which basically was interrupted by another war. So those two things seem unrelated, but they're actually related. This is our 7th Prime Minister in the last 10 years. And I don't know how many ceasefires we've had in the Strait of Hormuz, but it's probably close to 10. And what it shows is that if you're going to apply the paradigm shift, things have moved to a rapid state of acceleration. Whereas in the past, we believe things could have been quite static, and then when they become dynamic and then they return to becoming static, maybe things will always be dynamic. Maybe we've moved to a paradigm shift in the fact that things are no longer moving from one static state to another static state. And so that's really the intro to talk about what I believe is the future dynamic view of the way that monetization and pricing is going to work. I'm sweating buckets here because it's the UK and it's a very, very hot day. So essentially, I believe that we're moving from a seat standard to a token standard. And that token standard really is a usage-based standard. We've really had it for the last, 15 years since cloud really adopted. There's a few stragglers not yet adopted cloud, but cloud is highly penetrated into most corporate offices, most enterprises. So in that sense, we've already had usage. They weren't called tokens, but they also weren't called seats. They were, yeah, you need some compute. Yeah, you need some storage, EC2, etc. Yeah, that's fine. Charge this much, and charge you based on your compute size and obviously your storage. AI really accelerated that. AI brought that to the fore, where it's telling us that whether AI in the capital stack and whether the companies are going to be successful in IPO and valuations and business models, we know AI is here to stay. Just like the web was here to stay even after most of the companies collapsed around kind of the dot-com boom. The infrastructure was there and the idea was already planted. You couldn't go back to pre-internet thinking. It just wasn't going to happen. And so in many ways, you can't go back to seat thinking because we've already moved from the seat standard to the token or the usage standard. And token is just the raw element of being able to explain what we're actually doing. In reality, we were using compute tokens. In reality, we were using storage tokens. They just weren't called that. So token is a way of explaining it. And one level of abstraction that everybody's getting quite excited about is credits. That's another way of looking at it. But essentially, they're tokens at the raw kind of electricity level. And that token is really an input token transformed into some sort of output token, which hopefully transformed into some sort of value. And if we wheel it back to the resignation of the Prime Minister, there were many, not that many still, but emerging many, believe that no Prime Minister can be successful in the UK. And it's nothing to do with immigration or any other marginal policy. But at the root of the problem is the banking system. They cannot see it, but it is. And a very few commentators, whether it be a little bit Gary Stevenson on Gary's Economics, but a lot more on Henry Fudge, who's got a Rentier black hole thesis or the house in theory of everything. But essentially, unless you attack what the core problem is, which could be land, it could be housing, or it could be the bank and the Bank of England predominantly as part of that argument, you're not going to be able to be successful as a UK Prime Minister. It doesn't matter what colour, what stripe, what flavour you come in, left or right, you're not going to be successful. You're going to be able to do some polemic and grandstanding and maybe achieve better immigration, better renters' rights and stuff around the margin, but you're not going to solve the core problem, which is an economic problem at the core root, which is the bank and, in reality, the Bank of England. The way that we lend, the way that we allow things to collateralise, the reserve policy, the way that we issue gilts, the whole nine. So in many ways, if we take that parallel, the parallel in SaaS is that seats perhaps never really worked. They were an illusion. As, what's her name, Kyla Scanlon said, a kayfabe of a market. And we believe they work because we no one really tracked usage of that product because it was so cheap to deprecate and to syndicate to people. No one really tracked value extraction of that product, and we'll come on to value extraction in one sec. No one really knew their customer. They kind of knew who the customer was, but the customer base kept on expanding because it had to expand. We were trying to sell more shit. But no one really knew, and I'm basically drowning in my own sweat here, no one really knew their customer base. And I say knew as in really intimately know. Jane over there is an architect. She is using my CRM in this way. She disables these 15 parts of my feature, of the feature list. She really uses these 5 features. She uses them on a power law basis. Feature 2 is used 80% of the time. That kind of knowledge. Real in-depth shit. What is Jane, the architect, doing with this product? And do all architects act like Jane? What about accountants using CRM? What is Jimmy doing with this product? How many features does he use? Real in-depth shit. And many will counter this and say, well, how on earth are we going to know all that stuff? Well, we've had product analytics. I don't know, since my daughter was born 10 years ago. So in that sense, we didn't need to care because it wasn't important for our revenue model. We sold the seat, that was the seat, that is the model. But now we have to sell usage. We have to sell workloads. We have to sell increasing value. We have to sell increasing kind of quantification of this is how you use the product and we are going to make this element better and it's just for you. Seth Godin said, this is made just for you. Please enjoy. It's not for everybody else. It's just for you. That is what usage is. And you can go down the rabbit hole and you can see how someone like a Databricks and Snowflake sell the initial contract, but also try to get you on more workloads, more runs, more capacity, more ingress, more egress, just more. And in reality, they're trying to obviously sell the product more, but they're also trying to get you more value extraction via their product. As in, they're trying to give you more value. So, in fairness, they can extract more value. So where does this come back to? Keir Starmer. But it comes back because you have to really know the belly of the beast. And currently, the beasts are, it could be nationalised industry or industry that needs to be nationalised, the water, the electricity. And it needs to be understanding the real customer base. Yes, they may have a problem with certain elements around the stuff that's being polarised by the right wing, but they really have core economics at their heart. That is the heart of the problem. Why is the supermarket so expensive? Why is university so expensive? Why is pretty much everything so expensive? Why is concentration so high? But they're not going to say concentration's that high. But they want to be able to use the product of the state better, and they're unable to because it's so expensive. And so as we move from the seat standard to the token standard, a key part of that is understanding what is that shift. That shift is understanding that tokens are really just a nice name for usage, and usage is derived from someone the customer getting more and more and more value out of it, and then being told in a nice, polite way how to use the product in a better way to extract more value. So where do we go from here? Essentially, we're saying that if we move from a seat standard to a token standard, we have to re-architect the way we think about value. Value no longer can be booked up front on the back of RPOs and then slowly amortized. Value has to be sought every single day. And if you're architecting your firm around not necessarily just immediate value capture, but almost value exploration, it's a very, very different setup. And if you think about the seat setup, what you could do is design a product. Yeah, you need to update it a little bit. The second part is go and get some people to sell the shit out of it. And then the third part is obviously just maintain the product reasonably well, update a few features, sell some more stuff, and then orientate your whole finance function and the rest of the pretty much functions, operations and finance and customer service around reporting that same said number of clients that you had with an incremental kind of NDR, kind of net dollar retention, trying to get them to buy a bit more of the product, to buy a bit more of the product. Usage is very, very different. It makes you have to explore value, experiment with value, and explain value more. And in many ways, the previous PM may have not been very good at exploring and experimenting, and definitely not very good at explaining the usage of the product that he was trying to sell. But when you reorientate the enterprise, what does it mean? It means you can't be predicting out these 5 years because there's no way you can predict that. Not in the same way that you could predict that a client had a 2.8-year life. That is dead. So the metrics that we had in the past of even NDR may go out the window because it requires a complete reorientation of the whole operation. And in that reorientation requires someone to say we need a different type of person. And if I look at the example of FP&A, I'm an accountant of 1990. It's a lot of years, basically from 1990. I won't do the math, but it's 30 odd years and mostly investment banking. And in that time, you could see the rise of certain functions. And let's just take FP&A, for example. Why did FP&A arise out of accounting? We were accountants were sitting around, we were doing month-end accounts. I was in the product control region, which is valuation of derivatives and stuff. But generally, we were doing also finance balance sheet stuff. So what prompted that rise? Well, as I basically drown in my own sweat here, I'm going to finish without a tissue here. What prompted that rise? That rise was prompted by the fact that, one, we had better systems. There were no ERPs when I first started in 1990. That came about in the late 90s and the early noughties. Secondly, the CFO took on a bigger role, strategic role, prediction of the future, sitting at the board table, sitting at the investor relations table, much more than they were before. And the third part of that was we basically reorientated the firm around, in many ways, in SaaS seats. And therefore, that whole predictability around the seat was really, really. And if we think about what happens in a token standard, we now need a value experimentation thesis. We need the CFO to basically sponsor people to explore value. The prediction machine has to be much different than it was before because it couldn't be X times Y. It's almost like a Monte Carlo simulation, but not that that's excessive, but it's a much more simulated model because you don't know. The salespeople have to be better. So you have to budget differently for them. You are going to expect a lot more volatile return because that's just the way it's going to go. You can't have consistent returns when you're constantly selling usage. It's going to vary. And that whole structure means you need a different type of person. You need someone more like an architect who's going to basically understand the value to the client and architect the monetization of that value. And so providing the value and then architecting how you extract value at a reasonable rate that you and the customer are happy with. And so I believe in that period, there is the rise of a new type of finance stroke product person, and that person is called the monetization architect. And that person will be doing experimentation, but primarily understanding what the value capture is. And so the token standard really is going to introduce a new role, and that is the monetization architect. And that role, which doesn't exist yet, will become the dominant role in understanding, presenting, and doing the PowerPoints and doing investor relations, because that person will be able to say, this is how we're extracting value from a product where we're providing this much value. So you heard it here first. The role of the monetization architect is the missing role. And that role will become more and more important as we move to the token standard. I'm Gary, ex-investment banking finance guy, worked in finance for many, many years. I am touting and selling and pushing the role of the monetization architect. This is going to happen. Bye-bye.
The pricing committee, velvet rope cartel, turning every checkout into Dante's seventh hell. Can we simplify? Gets treated like a crime, cause complexity looks smart when you present it in a slide. Every metric looking healthy till the profit disappear, like magic trick performed by venture capitalists of the year. Net retention floating high like a helium parade till the AWS invoice enters with a switchblade.